It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Now, you can find me either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. That's another way to find me if you want to talk about PI stuff. Our archives are free at Spreaker.com. Go to Spreaker.com. I do a live show every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when we put up new content. And there's like 4,000 hours of shows on Spreaker. It's no joke. And we'll be getting, if you go to Spreaker.com and you look up our guest today, Mr. Tom B., we're talking about Dean Corll, who was a serial killer in, I think it was East Texas, and with all kinds of connections to the Kennedy assassination, child pornography, and pedophilia, all kind of weird stuff that's not commonly known. So, Mr. Tom B., are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you so much. Before we get into this whole Dean Corll story, remind the audience, who is Tom B.?
Oh, I'm just a amateur researcher, just looking into these serial killer cases, and I kind of got onto the Dean Corll case because of the connection between, or the semi-recently unearthed connection between John Wayne Gacy and pedophile kingpin John David Norman. And when you look deeper into the John David Norman story, you realize that he's also a tertiary character in the Dean Corll case. In fact, he was busted about 10 days after the Dean Corll case came to light.
Just amazing. We've only touched the surface, literally, in John Wayne Gacy. Because there's places you can dig right now where there's bodies. So we've only touched the surface, man. And then these bizarre cases. Describe a little more in detail the connection between the Norman and his pedophile ring and his Rolodex with 4,000 names, I believe. Yeah,
like 40,000 to 100,000
40,000, wow.
Yeah, like quite a bit of names. And the way he connects to Gacy is back in, I think, around 2018, WGN ran a news report about Michael Marino, which was a suspected Gacy victim which through DNA evidence proved to have not been actually a Gacy victim.
Right.
But they also bring up in that news report the possibility that he may have been a victim of John David Norman's pedophile ring, known as the Delta Project at the time. And this was furthered by evidence, or I should say several checks, made out to Philip Paskey, who was the right-hand man of John Norman, and well-documented right-hand man. The Chicago Tribune, a year before Gacy's capture, ran a huge story, and Philip Paskey and John Norman were at the center of it. And they had found several PDM contractor time cards and checks made out to Philip Paskey. And these were confirmed and authenticated by Terry Sullivan, the guy who prosecuted John Wayne Gacy. He's actually in that news report saying that these are legitimate. And John Wayne Gacy also talks quite a bit about John Norman and Philip Paskey during some jailhouse interviews. And in fact, he says that Philip Paskey had keys to his house, the infamous murder house, with the boys buried in the crawl space. But that was just never, ever brought up in any Gacy stuff until very recently. Yeah, and
don't forget, too, one of the first things Gacy asked him was, who else did you pick up? Yeah. You know? It's not like these guys are hiding it that hard. You know, they'll usually ask, hey, who else you got? You know, just say, okay. You know?
Yeah, and I cannot remember. I think it might have been his victim, Robert Pice, who documents show that he wasn't in town at the time that he was gone missing and murdered. I can't quite remember the details on that, so I may be wrong on some of those specifics, but I know there was a victim or two that they verified that he was not in town at the time that person went missing.
Let me ask you a question. Out of this whole bunch, are any of them still alive?
Sorry, repeat that?
Paskey, Norman, Gacy, are any of them still alive?
No, Gacy got executed. Paskey died in around 98, and Norman died in 2011.
What about the prosecutor you mentioned earlier? Is he still alive?
I think Terry Sullivan's still alive, yeah. Huh. He wrote the book, The Killer Clown, which is Yeah, there's two Gacy books. There's The Killer Clown, and then there's Defending a Monster by Sam Emirante, who's the guy who defended Gacy.
Right.
And then Sullivan wrote the book about prosecuting Gacy. But yeah, he authenticated on that news report those checks between Gacy and Paskey. So it is a real connection. It is not a BS conspiracy connection.
And how much were the amounts of the checks?
I don't remember offhand.
But just in general, though, very small checks, very large checks.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Let's hear. The one I have on my file is for $160.
Oh, $160. I was going to say $160,000.
No, just $160, which is still quite a bit of money for
in those days,
the late 70s.
Yep. Yeah, my parents' rent was less than $300 back in those. Oh, even less than that. I think their rent was like $80 back in in the 70s. It wasn't until 76 we moved to Staten Island. Their rent there, what for a house, a 3-bedroom house, was $300. Okay.
Wow.
Yep. I know, man. Capitalism does not work. Okay. Let's all point that out as we're here. Let's take a little break here. Dean Corll.
Yeah.
Remind us who Dean Corll was.
So Dean Corll, he was committing basically the same crimes as John Wayne Gacy before John Wayne Gacy was even known. But this was back in 1973, which was. Or it was not back, or he died in 1973. The August 8th, 1973 is when his accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., shot him to death because he had two teenage accomplices helping him lure boys in from the neighborhood so he could rape, torture, and murder them. Same exact victim type as John Wayne Gacy. Same exact thing of like a mass grave, but instead of in his basement, it was in a boat shed. And then kind of scattered around like beaches and stuff after he ran out of room. Much like what Gacy did because he dumped some bodies in the river when he ran out of room in the infamous crawl space. And, according to William George, the guy you had on, he also had some buried on an apartment property that the police won't let them dig up.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's more. I'm sure there's a lot more because in the files, Dean, they talk about, or his accomplices talk about Dean telling them about more murders that he committed before they knew him. So as far as is concerned, the official body count is 28 for Dean Corll, but chances are it's far, far higher. The problem is Dean Corll was dead by the time they figured out everything, so everything we're getting about his crimes is from his two accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. and David Owen Brooks.
Yeah, and don't forget, you can go back and find our first show on this at Spreaker.com or even, what's that called, Apple Plays and that kind of stuff there. And if you just Google Dean Corll, it'll come right up on those podcast platforms. Why do you think there's such a conspiracy to keep all this separate and private?
Well, because, and we sort of touched upon this on the last episode, but unfortunately I ran out of time. There was a lot of indications that his victims were involved in these sex trafficking organizations, child prostitution rings, because in 1975, 11 photographs of his victims were found in a raid on a warehouse in Houston. 11 photographs. And we'll get into who that guy is because that guy is also the most mentioned out of any of these pedophile rings in the actual police documents for Dean Corll. And it's a guy by the name of Roy Ames.
Okay, tell us about Roy Ames.
So Roy Ames he might be better known for his contributions, quote unquote, to the Texas blues scene. His biggest claim to fame was discovering Edgar Winter's brother, Johnny Winters, who actually left Texas because of this guy, and said that he screwed over so many people that it just makes him mad to think about it when he was interviewed about Roy Ames. And many artists there share the same sentiment about Roy Ames because he was notorious for ripping them off and using these master tapes and selling them without their permission or without royalties. And Roy Ames appears in the Dean Corll investigation as early as 1971 when, let's get to this here. when the father of two of the victims, by the name of give me a second here, I just lost all my...
No rush.
Okay. For the two brothers, Jerry Lynn Waldrop and Donald Waldrop, they were bodies number 10 and 9 in the boat shed. And their father had called up because they had gone missing in 1971, and he said that they were hanging out with this guy named Roy Ames, and that you know, he was a child pornographer, and he was giving him drugs and making him do sex movies and stuff like that. And creepily enough, right, when they're dug up, they're found with a half-filled-out police report on their in the grave on their body.
Really?
Yeah, half-filled-out police report. Now, the documents don't say what it said, but they said, yeah, it was like half-filled-out offense report for the police department, which is really creepy.
Well, what kind of offense, and what was the report about?
It doesn't say.
Wow.
It just says it found a half-filled-out police report on those two brothers, and then once the whole thing blows open, they get let's see here. They get a letter and a call from this guy named Stephen Dale Ahern. Now, Stephen Dale Ahern's a really interesting guy because he's an LAPD informant who's also a neo-Nazi and involved in the BDSM leather scene. And he contacts Houston Police Department because he's before that, he's in 1968 he gets interviewed by the FBI for making threats against RFK. He made 2 calls, one to the Greek Theater in March of '68, saying that there was a bomb that was going to go off, and then he made another call at American Airlines LAX and said that Senator Kennedy will be shot when he lands.
And how? What was the timing in correlation to the actual assassination?
Well, I can't remember when he was assassinated, but I mean, he called this in 1968, so it's the same year.
Okay.
Same year as the assassination, and he went to his psychiatrist and said that he had he told his psychiatrist that he had an urge to kill Senator Kennedy for some reason which he was unable to explain within himself. So, yeah, but that, and then on August 24th, 1973, he sends him a letter talking about how he was invited through a newspaper ad to fly out to Houston to meet up with Roy Ames, and that him and Roy Ames attended a BDSM party at Dean Corll's Pasadena apartment. And he says, in all caps in the document, it says Roy Ames knew Dean Corll, and that he used him to exploit young boys. And he also gave them a bunch of literature and
who used
magazines.
Who used who?
That apparently Corll was using
Ames
to procure some boys. Yeah.
That's interesting. You know, it's interesting. A lot of, when you think back, okay, the whole Atlanta child murders. You know, that young, you know, what's his name? Wayne Williams. Yeah, Wayne Williams. Right. You know, again, the connections with the talent agency and the young musicians.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
And yeah, and that's what Roy Ames kind of strikes me as.
Right.
Is kind of what Wayne Williams is because he was a talent scout basically. He would find these kids and rip off their music, but probably even worse, I have some more stuff to go into about Ames. Right,
and real quick though, then you have Roy Radin from the Process Church, and then all that stuff. Larry Flint's CIA brother-in-law. It pretty much admits to trying to kill Mitch Rebellion, all his stuff. And
was that guy Bill Metzer or whatever?
Yeah, right. But I'm talking about the Bill Dean stuff. Where, I loaned my gun for them to go do this assassination, but he walks away from it with no problem. And Roy Radin used to put on those vaudeville shows with these old timey blues guys and that whole crew as well. You see that there's a pattern, there's a thread through all that stuff, you know?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, Ahern also tells them that Ames, he said that Ames took more than likely about 30% of the porno photos and magazines around the country, and about 90% of the ones in the general area.
Wow.
So he was running something pretty big here, and this was under his record label Clarity Music. And I actually discovered this from it's an article from 1980 from the Plain Dealer, and it's an interview with this kid named Danny. And Danny, the article starts off with saying, when he was 11, Danny was forced to have sex with a man, his father. Then his father turned his son over to one of his good friends, child pornographer Roy Ames. And Danny is not this guy's real name, because he says he is a member of a prominent Houston family, but agreed to talk to the Plain Dealer only if his identity was protected. Danny said his grandfather has millions, and that his father has been photographed with governors and other nationally prominent figures. Authorities confirm this. And he was talking about, how he would ride around town helping Roy Ames out. Roy Ames would have, roll him around in a Rolls Royce and everything. And then, he said it had 6 tons of pornographic magazines.
Well, then,
when they finally...
Were you able, can you make an educated guess on who this kid Danny is and what his family was?
I don't know, honestly.
Yeah.
Because, all it says is, his grandfather... Because, he went to work with this guy when he was 11, because this came out in 1980. And by the time they're talking to him here, he's 22 years old. So he was a child when working with Roy Ames, and he talks about further how when they were going to bring up charges against his father, that he was able to pay to keep his name out of the paper, and got his son to deny the charges, so his father got off.
So the son Danny was trying to get his father arrested.
Yeah, something like that. But his father coerced him into not signing the confession or whatever. And he got off, and he was also able to pay to keep his name out of the paper. So, I kind of gives a little insight, some of these guys are probably busted a lot, but we'll never know. We'll never know.
Not that too, but here you have Gacy. He's such a how many movies, how many books were written about Gacy? He's a legend. But all these connections, nobody wants to touch it, man. You'd think there would be a TV series, a Netflix. Isn't Netflix out there trying to educate us on this stuff?
Yeah, they did. They touched upon it very briefly in that CBS documentary, The Devil in Disguise, but it's literally the last 10 minutes where they bring up the Norman and Paskey stuff. But you got to think, and this is stuff that's well known. Gacy was... You got to remember where Gacy came from, right? He came from Waterloo, Iowa, where he was a high-ranking member of this organization called the JCs, which is kind of like a Shriner, leadership group type of thing. Sure. And he was known to throw stag parties for members of the JCs. And he was originally arrested in the late 60s, I can't remember what year, for brutally raping the son of a U.S. representative.
Gacy.
Who was also a member of the JCs, And if I remember correctly, after he got out of jail, he was able to launch his own chapter of the JCs in Illinois, where he went to go after that. Despite the fact that this guy who's seemingly pretty low on the social, political totem pole rapes the son of a U.S. representative and gets to continue to be a member of this group.
It's a promotion.
It's a promotion because he's doing exactly what they want him to do.
He's doing a fine job there, young man. You're going to go places. Interesting, too. Roy Radin, again, back to that whole story, with his vaudeville tours, their sponsors were the local Fraternal Order of Police and the Police Benevolent Associations, and they would throw those stag parties too, with those strippers with the dancers that worked for Roy Radin, and the same thing. And when they would sell the tickets, we're doing this for the Police Benevolence Association here, and that's and they were kicking money back, to them,
you almost begin to wonder if Gacy was maybe more of kind of like a Craig Spence, Larry King kind of guy, not Nightly News Larry King, but Lawrence King of Franklin cover-up. Because people will talk about, he wasn't really that high up in Chicago politics, but you don't need to be high up because Chicago's a big city. It's one of the biggest cities in the United States of America, so you have a lot of really famous people going through there. Same with Houston. You have a lot of really big people going through there because Houston's a big city at the time. And you almost wonder if maybe some of these boys, and again, I don't really have any evidence for this, but some of these boys may have been disposed of because of these sex parties. And, his accomplices do talk about, or don't really necessarily point to that, but also, who knows? I mean, if you're going up against these pedophile rings, I mean, it's basically like the Mafia if it was a horror movie. So you wouldn't want to say any of that stuff anyways, and go, oh yeah, well he's working with all these guys and these names and faces have come through. Yeah, he'll get killed in prison for doing that. I'm pretty sure at the very least these guys don't want to die in prison or get shanked, throat cut while they're sleeping. Anyways,
it seems like they have these pimp types around politics on every level, and they use get me for favors and also too for blackmail purposes, to get dirt and compromise on these people. What were we going to say?
Well, I said back on Roy Ames here because, he's brought up several times in the police documents. And it really doesn't seem like they ever pursue. They do make mention of like, okay, we're going to pull the file on him and everything, but they never really seem to pursue him for the Corll stuff. But he is arrested in the late 73, early 74 for sending obscene literature through the mail, basically, which is sending child pornography through the mail.
Right.
But he's never really pursued for that.
By the way, I can tell you right now, most of this audience does not know right now that George Nader, who was one of Trump's advisors, who was in meetings with Trump Jr., he was in meetings with General Flynn, he was in meetings with Eric Prince. I think he arranged a meeting with Eric Prince. And General Prince, when it was a Defense Intelligence Agency in the White House, met with these people. He had a previous conviction for child rape and a dropped charge for child pornography. Later on, he was just sentenced for 10 years for child pornography, possession of child pornography on his phone when he was headed to Mar-a-Lago.
Oh, my God.
I could tell you right now that most of this audience, in fact, probably maybe 1%, maybe over two or three guys out there know that that he's been cooperating and they just dropped 5 years off the sentence. So whatever he's cooperating in right now, we don't know. There's indications you can read from his filings that they're sealed filings in his case. People who I know who know him personally are telling me that they're on the phone with him. Okay, and they knocked 5 years off his sentence, and he's not in the Bureau of Prisons right now. And that's child rapist, possession of child pornography, and so whatever this guy's cooperating with has to be bigger than that. You'd think,
Well, according to Trump recently, right? Yeah. Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself.
I didn't catch that. No, I didn't catch that one. Maybe he would know. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's kind of insane, the cognitive dissonance around Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. With the fact that he is probably in more, if not more, photographs and videos than he is with Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that exonerates Bill Clinton or anything like that, but there's literally videos of Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein sitting in the back cracking jokes with each other. And stuff.
Well, yeah, the Maria Farmer, and her sister just testified against Ghislaine Maxwell, and Maria Farmer says that she saw Ivana Trump with Ghislaine Maxwell, and they were out there.
Yeah, going to all the schools and stuff, right?
That's what she says, man.
They go to the middle schools and look for all the high-achieving girls. try to recruit them?
I don't know if they were high achieving. I think they were the other way around. I think they were going for people with troubled families. But he had school transcripts, too, of these kids. He had their school transcripts during the search warrant. It came up in the search warrant. And also, too, one of the victims, Virginia Giuffre, worked at Trump Mar-a-Lago. That's where she was recruited from. So the connections to Trump and Epstein are just up through the nose. Anyway, but back to Roy Ames. The reason why we brought Tom B here is Roy Ames. And
Let's talk about Roy Ames.
Now, Dean Corll. If Dean Corll's got 28 bodies to his name, that's a pretty cool serial killer, right? Just as cool as he doesn't dress up like a clown, but it's just as cool as Gacy, right? How come he's not more well known and famous in movies about him?
Yeah, because he died before they caught him, and like really the last word we hear on the investigation in that era is the fact that they find pictures of 11 of his victims in a child pornography stash in a Houston warehouse owned by Roy Ames.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So and this is weird. I don't know how if this is true. Or how they found this is true, but this is according to the book For Money or Love by Robin Lloyd, which is kind of about boy prostitution, written in the mid-'70s. But they say that police in 1975, this was probably February 27th, I think, 1975. Police are attempting to trace a stolen bike, and it leads them to Roy Ames' Houston warehouse. And this is the second time they go to this warehouse, by the way. And this time they find 15,000 color slide pictures, 1,000 books, 1,000 magazines, and they are able to identify 32 of the victims depicted in the color slide photographs, 11 of which were Dean Corll victims. And this ended up leading to the arrest of 5 people in California. And the authorities further state that Ames' material made its way as far as Sweden and Austria. And then an HPV juvenile officer stated that the department had elected not to pursue the lead any further, stating, "The parents of the boys have already suffered enough. There would be problems with positive identification, and we had to lead her to the portal ring anyways." You know, the same police department that said it was your fault, the parents. It was the parents' fault that they fell in with Dean Corll and they got killed.
Yeah, now they're worried about the parents suffering the trauma. They use that a lot, you know. Oh, we didn't want the children to go through more trauma. We didn't want this. But they seem to have no problem with it in all these other cases.
Yeah, and then you got, I think brought up so many times in the Dean Corll case. And, apparently we're just gonna not pursue that any further, despite the fact that, you know, it's confirming what many people said, because there's another guy, 1974, named Richard Van Payne, who was another informant from L.A., contacted the Houston police, said he was in a warehouse in Houston and saw pictures of the victims of Dean Corll in it. And this was before the raid where they actually found the pictures. So, again, this stuff is being brought up and is being confirmed, and they're just like, well, we don't want to reopen the trauma and hurt these victims. It's like, what?
What happened to Roy Ames? Did he ever do any time in jail or prison? Was he ever charged with anything?
Oh, yeah, he did about 10 years, because everything kind of, pretty much after that, everything kind of just started falling apart for him, and he got about 10 years in prison. Pretty much, up to like 85, 86. And then he got out, and he just re-entered into the blues scene, like nothing happened. And I think really the only thing that got only offense that he had, other than all the lawsuits for ripping off all these blues artists, was like a DUI. And then he died in 2003. And the Houston Press ran a scathing obituary on him. The title of this thing is Good Riddance to Bad Rubbish. And
I wonder what they put on his tombstone. That's what they put.
Oh, when you go to his obituary page, there's actually 2 really positive, glowing comments for Roy Ames on it.
What were those?
And one of the guys, I don't know if it's the same guy, because these are from like 2003, but one of the guys has like an Instagram page where he's talking about like summoning dark forces and drinking blood and stuff like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wait. The guy who wrote the glowing... see, now we're getting something. The guy who wrote the glowing obituary, you found his Instagram page, and there's stuff on there about drinking blood?
Well, no, it was a comment on the obituary.
And what was the comment?
Because it was on, like, the legacy.com, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Where they kind of archive all that. Well, some people can comment. And one of the guys who has the same name and is in that area has a bunch of weird stuff about him being, like, into like dark magic and blood drinking and weird stuff.
Now, what about occult connections to all this? Any? What do you think?
I don't know. That's always been kind of the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around. But yeah, man, there's some weird stuff here.
Yeah, there always is. Now, it brings me back because Rodney Acala, who we discussed earlier, had that picture of one of the supposed Gacy victims. He took a film class from Roman Polanski. He took one of his victims. He posed her body in front of Marlon Brando's house up on that hill up there where Michael Jackson lived and Jack Nicholson lived and Marlon Brando lived in that little alcove up there. Nearby is Robert Evans, another one. So do you see that kind of weird, kind of almost occult type connections? What about with this bunch here? Anything?
Really, the only mention of the occult that comes up is the fact that Elmer Wayne Henley Jr.'s girlfriend, Rhonda Williams, worked at an occult bookstore. That's pretty much the only thing in the documents that points to anything like that. But again, yeah.
And who is that person with the girlfriend? Who is that?
Her name was Rhonda Williams, and she was present the night Dean Corll was murdered because Elmer Wade Henley had invited her and his friend Timothy Curdley to go over to Dean's house. And Dean was really pissed about Elmer bringing a girl over to the house. So they got high, passed out, and they woke up with Dean tying them up. And he was going to rape and murder Tim, and he was forcing Elmer to do the same to Rhonda. And once he got loose, he grabbed Dean's .22 and shot him to death. So that's where she comes in on that.
Well, you just say occult bookstore, and you think, what? That's kind of benign. But just recently, this case where they're selling these body parts, this nationwide ring of Harvard mortuary, Harvard.
Yeah, I heard that.
Right. Right?
I kind of like how they found, I don't know why, but that reminds me of the fact that they found like a tons of skeletons in Ben Franklin's basement.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, there's that too, yeah. It was buried under his basement, yeah. And most of those were child-sized too, by the way, under Ben Franklin's house.
Oh, but really?
But the thing is that, they walk into this guy's house. He's got 44 skulls in there all over the place. He says they're his friends, and they're posed around. They're on his bed all over the place. And he was in the business of selling these bones and these body parts and flesh and skin and brain. And one of the folks involved in all this worked at Harvard, in the Harvard morgue, I think it is, or Harvard, some kind of access to something in Harvard, And what do you call it? So, and some of this was being sold through these occult bookstores,
Weird.
Weird is right. And there's a lot of money they were making,
And another thing I want to touch on real quick before I forget.
Moving on from bones and brains. What comes up next?
In several of their confessions, Brooks and Henley talk about how Dean told them that he was talking to other people like him and trading notes on how to murder boys, apparently.
Interesting.
And that he may have gone out to California to run with some people. And if your audience knows about California around that time, around the 70s, there was a thing called the Freeway Killer,
right,
which turned out to be three different guys, Randy Kraft, William Bonin, and a guy named Patrick Kearney. Now, Patrick Kearney is the most interesting one to me when it comes to kind of following that lead, because Patrick Kearney, for those that don't know, he was known as the trash bag killer because he would dismember his victims and tie them up in trash bags that he got from his job at Hughes Aircraft, Howard Hughes' defense contractor company that eventually got bought up by Raytheon. He was an engineer there. And it's kind of what led him to getting caught. because they were like special kind of bags that were only from his work. And apparently he also had an IQ of 180, but he was also a massive Dean Corll fan.
Really?
He had books and kept newspaper clippings of him, and he had the same exact victim type, with his youngest victim being 5 years old. And he killed between 21 to 43, if not more. Another interesting thing that he says is the police were asking him about others being involved, and he says, inadvertently, I lived in Long Beach and did a lot of corresponding with people who put ads in the free press and then declined to elaborate further. Another thing he said that was really interesting, as he was talking to author Dennis McDougal, and he said he does the same thing that Gacy does, where he's able to tell you about all these bodies and all these murders committed, but like weirdly denies them. But this is what he says. You might find evidence that other people are involved in my case. You could look at confiscated photographs and films that the police have. They should have obtained quite a few investigating other cases similar to mine. You might find photos of alleged victims in my case. You should especially look for movies showing live torture and evisceration.
You think he's talking about Norman? You think he's talking about Norman?
This is talking about serial killer Patrick Kearney, who was one of the freeway killers.
Yeah, but when he's saying that Gacy had other films, do you think he's talking about Norman?
He could be, but he could also be talking about Ames, because Patrick Kearney,
right.
He went to Texas, so he was known in Texas too. I don't know if he's murdered anybody in Texas, but and another interesting thing kind of ties back to the Kennedy assassination. He was talking to he was corresponding, because this guy's still alive. He's 83. He was writing letters with this Australian author named Amanda Howard. And he claims in the letter that he attended military language training school with Lee Harvey Oswald, and that he was going to accompany Oswald on his second trip to Mexico to try to get into Cuba. I don't know if that's true, but it's really interesting, and they're pretty much the same age.
Yeah, that is interesting, because there's a lot of was that really Oswald in Cuba, in Mexico?
Yeah.
That's but once you get down these holes, man, there's just so much dirt being muddied up with the waters. To mix metaphors all over the place, right? the waters get so muddy.
The deeper you get, the more you find out that these narratives are not what they are, what you're told they are, but you're still not quite sure exactly what they are, because it's just like. Yeah,
I was always going to say, if I write a book, I'm going to call it the more I learn, the less I know.
It's pretty much how it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and real quick, I don't want to bust your train of thought, though. What were we going to say?
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, what about now? You got guys like Corll has got 28 bodies, in his boathouse. Did he live alone? What about a wife, a family, anybody who might? Because
he had a platonic girlfriend that he saw once in a while.
Yeah.
They said that they only attempted to have sex once and then never tried again. Actually, when he was caught, or he was actually murdered in his parents' house, which is a thing that always comes up in a lot of these cases where they're just killing people in their parents' house. But his mom did live in Texas at the time, so she wasn't there. But yeah, the Pasadena home that he was killed in was his mom's house.
And what were you saying? There's a pattern of people killing people in their mom's house? Is that what you said?
Or because you were saying with Rodney Acula was doing that kind of thing. William Bonin was also doing that too. One of the freeway killers, actually, interestingly, also had teenage accomplices.
Yeah, Begenwald as well. He was doing that. And then I had this woman, Kathy Benansky, on the show, who was friends with this cannibal guy, who picked up this drunk woman at a liquor store, took her back to his place, and called up his friends and says, hey, you know how we've always talked about killing someone and barbecuing them in the backyard? And this guy lived in his garage with no sink, no bathroom in his garage. So he's chopping up this woman, barbecuing her in the backyard, walking through his parents' house, washing up, changing socks. Just imagine. But the families don't get charged. What the hell? How does that work?
I have no idea. Because you were also saying about that one guy in Vegas that was like torturing a prostitute before he shot up like a bunch of people.
Right, yeah, we talked about this.
In his parents' house. How the hell do you not hear her screaming?
Exactly.
Bloody murder.
Yeah.
Or at least tell him to turn down the damn music.
Right, right. And then he goes on to shoot up a whole supermarket. Yeah, there was another one too in Vegas where they tortured a little boy in front. The mother-in-law is blaming her daughter's boyfriend. I think she was.
Or that what's that dude's name? It was that killer couple in Canada where
Homolka.
Yeah, they were doing all that stuff in their parents' house too.
Yeah. And even there's some people around Ted Bundy, that ex-girlfriends and stuff like that people think they knew. He was into all kind of weird stuff. And he's another one, too, who said that, hey, there's more people involved. Some of the people who do this, they have their own cremations. They have access to crematoriums,
Well, yeah, and that's the thing that really kind of freaks you out when you think about it.
Yeah.
Is a lot of the guys that get caught are the ones that leave bodies behind so they can be traced.
Right.
Let's think about the guys who never get caught. Think about the Corrals and Gacy's that are out there who have passed on, and we had literally no idea, and probably never have any idea. That there could be like a mass grave out there somewhere that we just don't know. Oh, because they're a lot better at hiding it than
I would guess.
The other guys were.
There's thousands of them. If you drive cross country, and there's this lot of little small towns, man, where you wouldn't believe how people live. There's one or two cops, working that town. They're friends with half these people, and sometimes they're into the same stuff. The judges are into it, the DAs are into it.
Oh, yeah, you can have a whole town that's pretty much into this kind of stuff, and no one's none the wiser,
Yeah, you can only wonder the horrors that go on behind those closed doors. You just drive right by them,
Yeah, because, when especially, that Boys for Sale documentary that I mentioned in the previous episode, and really when you read anything about, like, the boy prostitution, especially in Houston, there were a lot of bodies turning up that weren't Corll or anybody that they're just unsolved. So who the hell knows who's out there doing that kind of stuff, Yeah,
and that was Texas, and we have pretty much the same thing around the same time going on in Atlanta.
Yep.
And then you got the whole who's that other guy, Dahmer? Pretty much.
Well, yeah. What's the weirdest thing about the Dahmer case that just screws with me is the cop that brought back the they fire him, but then he becomes the president of the police union in Milwaukee for like 20 years.
I had an author come on this show and defend that guy, and then the more we got into it, I says, "Is the whole reason you wrote this book is to defend this guy?" And he goes, "Yep," Same thing with that Dannemora escape, I had a guy on here wrote a book about that, and I says, "Come on, man!" He says, "Those guys are hiding out in those hunting camps and those hunting cabins all over the place. Up there, you're trying to, He goes, "Oh no, I'm friends with all those guys. I know those guys." Nothing happened there. Anytime there's a prison escape, man, I'm really suspicious about these tunnels they're talking about. When you can just,
It's like, how incompetent are you that you let Bundy escape twice?
Right.
He escapes prison twice.
And then he has a car and new ID waiting for him.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. And I'm not super familiar on the Bundy case, so I can't really speak on that in any kind of authority, but it's just little things like that. Or another thing that really weirds me out about Jeffrey Dahmer is that he was able to, and this is like publicly known, is that he was able to call the White House and get a tour for his class. I don't know what that means, but...
Yeah, I interviewed the guy who was his teenage friend when that happened. Okay, Durf.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you listened to that? Yeah. Durf it was about the book he wrote was about Kent State, but he also wrote that book about his childhood with Jeffrey Dahmer. And he goes, "Yep, man, that's what happened." You gotta wonder.
Who knows?
Yeah, I know, right? Who knows? You gotta wonder, man, what's going on with all this weird stuff. So, what are you looking at next, man? You're still embedded in this. You told me off there you're gonna write a book. So I'm gonna put some pressure on you. Okay. It's actually write this book.
I'm gonna figure out some way to, if not a book, to condense all this information into an easily readable format, because it is, and people have done it before when they've kind of put this information together. But I'd really like to do a thorough dive into this, because you don't really have a lot of good information in one place on all these pedophile rings, because regardless of whether or not you believe Dean Corll was deeply involved with these guys or not, the fact is this is a whole bunch of history that's been pretty much forgotten, but it still involves guys who were friends with J. Edgar Hoover and stuff like that. So, I think it's kind of important to... Yeah,
I don't think you shared the J. Edgar Hoover connection on the air. I think that was off the air before we started. Why don't you tell the audience about that?
Yeah, so when they busted John Norman after the Dean Corll murders, they found a child pornography film where they were able to identify the cameraman, who was a person named Guy Strait, who was running this pedophile ring with another guy named Billy Byers Jr. And Billy Byers Jr.'s father was a Texas oil millionaire for Humble Oil. And he was running with guys like Clint Murchison Sr., who's the father of the guy who started the Dallas Cowboys, Sid Richardson, who was another big oil guy. And he also had adjacent bungalows at Del Charro Hotel, which was Sid Richardson's hotel. Billy Byers Sr. did adjacent bungalows with J. Edgar Hoover, and they were purportedly very close friends, to the point where, according to Anthony Summers, he was one of 3 people that Hoover called when learning that JFK was shot, other 2 being the Secret Service and RFK, and then Billy Byers Sr., his friend, apparently. And apparently, Billy Byers Sr. died in mid-60s, 65. But apparently, J. Edgar Hoover was still in contact with Billy Byers Jr. and was buying boy prostitutes from him, according to a guy named Charles Krebs, who Anthony Summers interviewed for his book, Secret and Confidential, or Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover. And he said that they would bring boys from California or to La Jolla and drop them off to Hoover, who was sitting in a limousine with Clyde Tolson. And he said that Billy Byers Jr. said, up till Hoover's death in 1972, he was still receiving Christmas cards from him and stuff like that. So some interesting stuff there. And I'm sure your audience knows about Roy Cohn and all the sex trafficking going on there. So there's quite a bit more history that I haven't really gotten into as much.
Yeah, Roy Cohn, according to Rothstein.
And J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, according to Rothstein.
Also Trump's mentor, interesting enough.
Well, man, we can get into all of that if you want. It's amazing how many people Trump is surrounded by. That guy Hall, the Yankee player who had his little teenage girl right next door to Trump in Trump Towers. R. Kelly lived in Trump Tower in Chicago,
Oh, yeah. You want to hear a weird story about R. Kelly? This is secondhand information I got from someone.
Okay.
But apparently back in the day, it was known in the local Chicago high schools that you can meet up with R. Kelly after school at the McDonald's. And my friend was saying, and I don't know if this is true, but that I can't remember, one of her friend's aunts had actually went to prom with R. Kelly.
Yeah.
When he was an adult, she was a minor.
Well, this woman, Trevion Cutt, who everyone's calling her the publicist for Kanye West, who's involved. She's indicted. She's just turned herself in today down there in Georgia for this election interference. Her and a couple of thugs were trying to intimidate an election worker. She was R. Kelly's publicist during the time all this was going on, when he was molesting those kids and abusing those kids, keeping them in cages, dog cages, in Trump Tower in Chicago. She worked for him. She was in that house. She was in, anyway, look. Real quick, we're out of time. Anthony Summers, is he alive and around for interviews, or what's the story with him?
I don't know. I think he is still alive. He'd be an interesting guy to get on. Clifford Leyendecker, if he's still alive, because he wrote that Children in Chains book that I mentioned. He's probably pretty old at this point, like probably in his late 80s at this point, but I believe he's still alive.
Well, you know where we are now with the show. It's a race against time, man. Let's get them on the record before they go, man. I'm turning into the crypt keeper over here, man. You know, with the way we're losing.
Oh yeah, I mean, you got some pretty good stuff, like the guy who found the tunnels under the McMartin School or whatever.
I hope he's still alive.
That's pretty crazy. That's pretty crazy that you got that from the guy, because that seems like the only place that he's actually said anything about that.
Oh no, yeah, people.
So.
Oh no, yeah, people who talk about him, people who mention him, never even talk to the guy, and Mr. Bruce Michaels, what do you call it? Right after we did that, the FBI put out a document. With a sketch of the McMartin property, and there's an arrow. Yeah, there's an arrow by the detached garage tunnel entrance.
Yeah, weirdly enough, smack dab in the middle of the finder's document.
Yeah, right. Which
is it's so weird, you know, like, and that's a whole other rabbit hole. Yeah. I'm sure you've gone down.
Yeah, well, not as much as I'd like to, and then anyway, we're out of time.
All right.
We've been talking to Tom B. here. He's been talking to us about the Dean Corll case. We did a previous show, so if you look up Dean Corll, you can hear some more details on the show we did about the Dean Corll case. And we're going to encourage our friend here to write a book and come back and when the book's all put together, because, again, this stuff has to be gotten down. So many official stories about the Gacy and all these characters that you wonder who's putting them out. Tom, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night, brother.